Hello. Hi, that's really tall. It's probably set for Julian, not me, so I'm just going to get on tippy toes. Good afternoon. I am Farrah Warner, the Executive Director of the Metcalf Institute, and I'd love to welcome you to the University of Rhode Island and to the beautiful Graduate School of Oceanography campus. It is so wonderful to see old friends and colleagues and new friends that are taking part in this year's annual Science Immersion Workshop. I am going to give the land acknowledgement this afternoon. The University of Rhode Island occupies the traditional stomping ground of the Narragansett Nation and the Niantic people. We honor and respect the enduring and continuing relationship between the indigenous people and this land by teaching and learning more about their history and present-day communities, and by becoming stewards of the land that we too inhabit. It is also my great pleasure to introduce our American Sign Language interpreter, Joe Welch, who will be with us. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Metcalf Institute's annual Leeson Lecture. The Leeson Lecture was established in 2019 to honor Rob Leeson following his retirement from the Metcalf board. Rob came to virtually every lecture and often had a notepad and pencil to take notes, and was always fascinated by whatever the topic was and eager to learn from the leading scientists, science communicators, and journalists we bring to campus. In keeping this legacy alive, we honor the memory of Rob Leeson. Rob served on Metcalf's advisory board for many years and was a staunch supporter of our mission to advance the public's understanding of climate and environmental science. Rob was one of the first people I met along with his lovely wife, Peggy, when I first joined Metcalf. I remember spending a lovely few hours on what was then a very snowy January day in 2024, learning about Metcalf and what inspired them about our mission. Rob passed away. I'm sorry, I always get verklempt on these things. Rob passed away earlier this year, and I would like to honor him with a moment of silence, please. Thank you. Now, thank you to his family for being here with us today. And now I would like to welcome University of Rhode Island President Mark Parlange, who will introduce our speaker for the day, Dr. Julian Agyeman. President Parlange.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. So wonderful to see you here. Thank you for joining us in person at the Narragansett Bay campus and online. It's also very nice to welcome Charlotte Metcalf today, who's joining us all the way from Vermont in this bad weather. So thank you for coming, Charlotte. And Farah, thank you for getting us started and for giving the university land acknowledgement. So I'm really pleased to be here to welcome you all to the 6th annual Leeson Lecture, which, as we just learned, honors Robert Leeson, a longtime advisory board member, a tremendous advocate for and supporter of the Institute's mission. Rob and his wife Peggy have been steadfast friends and supporters at Metcalf and URI, and Rob is greatly missed. This series has allowed Metcalf Institute to bring incredible guest lecturers to URI, including our speaker today, from across the country and around the world to discuss topics of pressing global importance. And this afternoon, we will take a deep dive into how our food systems adapt to climate change. Rhode Islanders, like the rest of the world, are feeling the effects of a rapidly warming planet, and the connection between our food systems and climate is at the core of this year's annual immersion workshop for journalists. So welcome to all the journalists who are here today as well with us. At URI, many of our faculty, staff, and students are working better to understand the impact of climate change on food systems and how to help communities respond. Indeed, our state of Rhode Island has had a great history of industry, but we are also deeply aware of the effects industry has had on our climate and on our food systems. Our rivers were dammed early as Rhode Island led a young country into the Industrial Revolution, which has left us today with crumbling dams in some places and polluted waters in many others. Our bays and our coasts have served as the foundation for the vibrant fishing industry and our thriving tourism industry. And the University of Rhode Island has long been at the forefront of the blue economy, including cutting-edge aquaculture and fisheries research and practices. And so obviously this connection between our natural world and our need for vibrant economies is long-standing. But understanding those connections has become even more critically important now in the face of climate change. And this is why we are here this afternoon. I should say that the Metcalf Institute is really a key player globally in this communication, both here at the university and around the world. And so I'm pleased to be here tonight to introduce our guest lecturer this afternoon, Dr. Julian Agyeman. So it turns out that we have lots of friends through our connections over the years, and it's really great to have you here, Julian. Dr. Agyeman is coming to us from the Department of Urban and Environmental Policy and Planning at Tufts University. He is a critical urban planning and environmental social science scholar. His research focuses on environmental and food justice. In the early 2000s, he developed the increasingly influential concept of just sustainabilities, which explores the intersecting goals of social justice and environmental sustainability. In his talk today, he will outline the concept of just sustainabilities as a response to the equity deficit of much sustainability thinking and practice. And he will help us explore the idea of who can belong in our cities will ultimately determine what our cities can become. He has many, many publications. He's author and co-editor and co-author of 13 books. He's ranked as one of the top 10 most highly cited urban planning academics in the US and Canada. Among other very interesting things, in November 21, he was invited by then Boston Mayor-elect Michelle Wu to be a transition advisor on her transition committee. He's won numerous awards, including in November 23, he became an honorary doctorate at the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, Sweden. And in March of this year, he was awarded Tufts Distinguished Scholar Award by the Faculty Research Awards Committee. So congratulations on that, too. So we are so grateful to have you here today for this important discussion. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Julian Agyeman.
Thank you. Thank you for the warm welcome to Rhode Island. Warm and wet welcome. It was sunny and 90 degrees when I left Boston. I crossed the state line and look what happens. So my talk today is called Just Sustainabilities in Policy, Planning and Practice. Some of you might be thinking, why does he put the word just before the word sustainability? So if we actually, even if we did a survey among yourselves, but if we went out into the streets of any city and got 10 people who had an idea about sustainability, 9 or even 10 would say, well, it's about the environment. And of course it is about the environment, but I could also imagine us legislating for a green world. Would it be any more socially just simply by making it a green world? Let me give you an example that I'm going to talk about more later. The second greenest city in the US is Minneapolis. Does greening equal social justice? It doesn't. It can, and we'll talk about that. But just greening the city, and this is one of the failures, I think, of environmentalism, that nature will solve our problems. It will in many ways, and we're using nature very creatively, and absolutely. But in and of itself, it will not solve social injustices. Let me start just by following up on what was said in the introduction about an indigenous thought. I want to play you a short video, and I want you to listen especially to the young man at the end who talks about the word belonging, because I'm going to be talking a lot about this concept of belonging. I think it's a very powerful, very human concept, and it's very apposite today, given that we are trying to disbelong a lot of people who felt they did belong.
What does belonging look like if nothing of your culture, history, language, or art is visible in the streets, parks, buildings where you live? How can you ever feel welcome there? The Indigenous Placemaking Council seeks to restore Indigenous presence to Canadian cities, towns, and communities.
What does belonging look like if you can't see anything of your culture, your people, in the parks, the streets, the urban fabric? And I'm always amazed, having spent 6 months in New Zealand, at how the Maori are present, even on the tail fin of Air New Zealand planes, even in the language of New Zealand, even in the sports of New Zealand. And yet, where are the Narragansett? Where are the Wampanoags up in Massachusetts? We've erased their presence. So think about this concept of belonging, because again, as I say, it's very apposite at the moment. And hold that thought. I just want to tell you a little bit about this concept of just sustainabilities. So it was about 20, 25 years ago, we started to look at some of the literature coming out after the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, and it was all about the environment. There was what I call an equity deficit in sustainability thinking. It was all about recycling, sustainable agriculture, it was all about good stuff. But where was the notion of equity or social justice? So we developed this book, Just Sustainabilities, Development in an Unequal World, which focused explicitly on equity and justice, on the links between environmental quality and human equality. And if you are still a little bit skeptical, think about anywhere in the world that environmental degradation is happening on a large scale, whether it's the Amazon, the Congo rainforest, Central Australia, the Kamchatka Peninsula in Russia. Environmental degradation doesn't happen in isolation. It always happens in relation to infringements in human rights and social injustices. They are linked. And yet, it wasn't until only a few years ago that people like Amnesty International and Greenpeace started talking. Our social movements were completely separate, environmental social movements and social movements. And I would argue that neither have achieved what they could have done because they weren't talking to each other, they were working in silos. So we were arguing really that sustainability can't simply be seen as a green thing or an environmental concern, important though those are. A truly sustainable society, we argued, was one where wider welfare questions, social needs, economic opportunity are integrally related into this notion of environmental limits of supporting ecosystems. So don't get me wrong, this isn't just social justice. This is, how do we do social justice within environmental limits? I don't like to advertise other people's books. I'm an academic. I expect you to buy my books. But this book, 2009, is excellent. It's a classic, and it's two British researchers who basically got data, comparable data, from all 190 or so nations on the planet, and they found something really interesting. The bigger the gap between rich and... Well, let me backtrack. It's not poverty that... I mean, poverty is bad, but it's inequality that is really doing us in. And not just the poor, the rich as well. What they found was that there's a correlation between the level of inequality in societies and the extent of social malaise, whether it's teen pregnancies, high school dropout rates, drug addiction, domestic violence, you know the list of social malaises. So the bigger the gap, the more social malaise. What they also found was that if you look at advertising revenues, why they decided to look at advertising revenues, I don't know, but it showed something quite spectacular. Advertising revenues increase as inequality increases. Advertisers love inequality because inequality sells. People start buying stuff. They start buying shit. They start buying anything to get themselves into the next level, keeping up with the Joneses. And this doesn't just happen in the poorer groups in society, it happens in the rich and the super rich. There's an escalator of consumption. I've highlighted in yellow, inequality heightens competitive consumption. What does consumption heighten? Our carbon footprint. inequality is driving climate change. Now, Bill McKibben, 350.org, get with the program. I love all of their publications on sustainable agriculture, sustainable transportation. They are solutions, but the driver of the problem in my mind, or at least one of the major drivers, is inequality. If we lessened inequality between and within nations, we would lower our carbon footprints. So if we really want to understand sustainability, our focus should be both on human equality and environmental quality together, not as separate issues. So how am I defining just sustainabilities? I'm defining it as the need to ensure a better quality of life for all, now and into the future, in a just and equitable manner, while living within the limits of supporting ecosystems. And so there are 4 conditions here. We must commit to improving people's quality of life and well-being. We must commit to meeting the needs of both present and future generations. We must commit to justice and equity in a more nuanced way than we have before. Often people think of justice as being access to decision-making, procedural justice. And we have that in most of our laws, that people can have a comment period, etc. Whether they use it or not, or whether they show up, that's another matter. We also like to think about distributional justice. You know, they shouldn't get all the bad stuff and they shouldn't get all the good stuff. It should be more equally spread out. But I want you to look at that word recognition. That's a really important term that is becoming more and more important in sustainability terms, environmental justice terms. Recognition says if we do not recognize the rights to be of certain groups in society, how can we ever do justice by them? How can we ever reconcile with them? How can we ever come to a position where we might have some sort of reparative or restorative processes? Recognition. Black Lives Matter. Me Too. Say Her Name. All of the cries around the world for indigenous rights. If we don't recognize these people's rights, then they are virtually unknown to the legal system. And then all of this, again, must happen within ecosystem limits. I'm old enough to remember 1968, the first satellite images of this big blue marble in space. And it got me right here. And there's no pipeline taking stuff away or bringing more stuff in. There's no planet B, there's no plan B. So we have to accept that we live in a planet of limits, and we must do this human enterprise a lot better, more justly and more equitably. A little bit of a slap on the back for me now. Just Sustainabilities both underlies and predates the wonderful work that Kate Raworth did on donut economics and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. For those of you who can see this idea of donut economics, that's the donut. Why she chose a donut, not a sort of whole wheat bagel or something like that, which is a lot more healthy. Why a donut? But anyway, the point is, the outside edge of the donut represents the ceiling. We must not puncture the ceiling with our pollutants, with carbon dioxide, but of course we are. We're puncturing that ceiling all the time. We also must recognize that there's a social foundation below which we must not let people fall. The $1 a day United Nations poverty line is taken as being that. Too many people are falling below that. But the argument is that the donut, the place between the environmental ceiling and the social foundation, is a safe operating space for humanity. That's what we have to aim to get people into to enjoy a future, and a future for our kids and offspring on this planet. Because I'm working in urban planning, I want to give 4 overarching thoughts on urban planning before I give my 3 case studies. What is urban planning? One of the most elegant, pithy definitions is there, Patsy Healy. Urban planning is managing our coexistence in shared space. 2 wonderful words, coexistence and shared space. Coexistence, shared space. That's what cities are, always were, back to the earliest cities. They were shared spaces. We have to coexist. But our task as urban planners, and people generally, is slightly more complex. It would be easier to coexist in shared space if everybody looked the same, ate the same, prayed the same, made love the same, did everything the same. But we're not. We're increasingly different and diverse. How do we coexist in shared space with cities of difference, where the other is constantly present in our lives? We can see it as a negative, or we can see it as an opportunity, as I'm going to go and talk about. We also need to move from racial planning to reparative planning. American cities are planned around segregation, period. That's not woke, that's fact. From racial covenants to redlining, to racist zoning, to exclusionary zoning, to unfair housing policies. Our cities don't look like they do by accident. They were planned that way. And so we need to shift from that, and a lot of chief planners, a lot of organizations, my students all want to know, how are we going to shift from a racial planning model to a more reparative model? Third point I want you to think about, we in the sustainability world, we're always thinking about what cities or places can become. And that's good. We're always dreaming about a better future. That's good. But who gets to belong in those cities? Like the young man said, what is belonging? What does it look like if you can't see any of your culture in the spaces, places of the city? So I would argue that we need, as urban planners, as sustainability advocates, we need to right the balance a little bit more. We're very good at dreaming about the kinds of futures. We've got the science. We know what we need to do. We're just not doing it. But we also need to take more people along with us. I don't want to be part of elite dreaming about what cities can become. I want a wider discussion about what can happen in cities by helping more people to belong in the city. And then finally, I want you to think of Just Sustainabilities as being an adaptation of what the Congress for New Urbanism call human scale planning. I like the idea of human scale planning, but I want you to put an E on the word human. I want humane scale planning. I want planning for human dignity, planning that inculcates empathy. We need that. So I'm going to give 3 examples. I'm going to talk a bit about this concept of spatial justice. How do we allocate rights in urban spaces and places? I'm going to talk about what I call the Minneapolis Paradox. How does one of the most green, liberal cities in the US end up as the epicenter of our current introspection over structural racism? And I'm going to talk about food justice. And I'm going to ask a provocative question. What is local food in intercultural societies? What is local food? Who gets to say what local food is? Is it the Narragansett people, or the current residents of Rhode Island, or the plethora of immigrant groups that want to grow their own crops? What is local food? So let's start with spatial justice. Not many cities in the world, Jerusalem, Belfast, Nicosia, have walls separating different groups. Not the medieval walls, the walls that separate different groups. But as David Lammy, the British MP and now Foreign Secretary in the UK, he said, just as social justice requires that life chances are not distributed along class or race lines, spatial justice requires that they are not distributed geographically. But yet, we do have spatial injustice. Hands up, who grew up in a town or city where there was a railway line, a creek, some other feature, and on one side they lived, and on the other side you lived, and their life chances were very different to yours? Hands up, how many of you grew up in towns like that? Yeah, maybe 10, 15%. Well, in Boston, here's the reality. If you grow up in the Back Bay, you can expect to live 23 years longer than somebody who lives in Nubian Square, Roxbury. 2 miles, 23 years. That's spatial injustice. That's how it pans out. And every US city has the same kind of rapid change according to neighborhood, which has been put there by urban planning and its associated sort of health effects. Let's bring spatial justice down to the level of the street. Here's two streets. On the left, Södra in Gothenburg, Sweden, and on the right, Massachusetts Avenue, just near Harvard University, where the crane is, near where I live. Those streets are identical width, but they couldn't be more differently organised spatially. The Swedes have imposed spatial justice on the street. The streetcars flow regularly and they're free. To the left of the streetcar is a fence. That's the only part of the street that you can drive private vehicles on. So the principle that the Swedes have worked on is equity. You have equal rights if you're a cyclist, a walker, a transit driver, or a vehicle driver, whereas in the US, what's the principle there? The bigger your vehicle, the more rights you have. That's the good old US principle. Get a bigger vehicle, and then you've got more rights. That's what we work on. I mean, I know we're kind of laughing nervously about it, but that's... And you know, there's so much pushback in Boston at the moment on bike lanes and on anything that kind of slows down the private motor vehicle. I'm going to talk more about this. But one thing I want you to think about is, look at the apartment blocks. So kids live in those apartment blocks. How are the Swedish kids wired differently to the American kids? The Swedish kids go out every day and they see a democratized street. The American kids come out and they see organized chaos, people cutting in. And how does that wire us differently? To my knowledge, nobody's done a PhD on that yet. I know this is an oceanography institute, but let's think about it. I think there's some interest, because this isn't just idle speculation. Street traffic has a direct influence on social interaction on streets. So if you look on the left, on a heavily trafficked street, you have less friends per person and less acquaintances than on the lightly trafficked street, the green street, you know, with the bump outs, with the raised patches on the road to slow people down, the 20-mile-an-hour zones. And you might say, well, what's the equity implications here? Well, I can tell you who lives on the heavily trafficked streets and who lives on the lightly trafficked green streets, or complete streets, as we might call them. But there is some good news. I mean, way back in the Bloomberg administration, he employed a brilliant transportation planner, Janet Sadiq Khan. They brought in Jan Gehl, the architect of the Copenhagen miracle of the last 60 years, and they started experimenting, seeing what we'll do with streets. Look at Times Square, top left. That was when they were experimenting before they fully made it pedestrian. And I just love the woman in red there, sitting there as if it's the most normal thing to be doing, sitting in a deck chair in the middle of Times Square. Bottom right, outside of Macy's on, what's the street? Yeah, thank you. I usually give a free book out for that, but yeah. But the point here is, we like to sit out and talk. We need to see streets as people spaces. That's spatial justice. Not every street can look like that, but we could certainly be more efficient in deciding which streets in our cities could be people streets. And COVID actually did us a solid in that respect. I mean, still in Central Square, Cambridge, you've got the COVID patios, and the businesses love them. And traffic doesn't get snarled up. I think Cambridge City Council will make them permanent. But the other bigger picture here is, we have to do what is possible, not what is probable. If we do what we've probably always done, we will be stuck in the same messy old, unfair old paradigm. We need to think about what is possible and move towards that. But as I said, we're very good at disbelonging people. Top left, and this is called defensive architecture, by the way. Top left, that ledge was used by skateboarders. So they decided to put some nubs on there to stop those teenage skateboarders. You know, the kids who sort of fall over and it looks like they're never going to get up, and then they just get up and brush their legs, and they're fine, you know. I'd be in a piece on the floor. The middle is the the park bench, which, you think, oh, they've put armrests on there. They're not armrests. They're to stop homeless people sleeping. Top right, the aggressive-looking steel rods that some architect or designer has made the call to put in there. Now, we've all been to stations, railway stations, bus stations, and you see those spikes to stop the pigeons landing. What's the difference? What's the difference? We're doing this to human beings. Remember what I was saying about dignity and empathy? This is not dignified, and it's not empathetic. The bottom right, the rich doors and the poor doors. Every city that has large apartment buildings generally has to have some at affordable rates. But some cynical developers, obviously with the say-so of the city, have allowed two types of doors. Rich doors on the boulevards where the rich come, have their cars valet parked, and then they get in the special elevators and go up to the penthouses, and then round the back is the poor doors. These have been documented in Vancouver, in New York, in London. They're all over the world. We do this. This is what we do. This is what we do. And then bottom left is an overpass in Seattle. It used to be a homeless encampment until the city decided, let's use sustainability infrastructure. Let's use bike racks so that the homeless people move on. They thought that the public would be behind them, but very fortunately, the cycle community in Seattle said, not on our watch. We've got a problem with homelessness, we know that, but do not use cycle infrastructure to try and move homeless people on. So these are just some of the ways that we push people on. Or if you're Governor Abbott, you just fly a whole bunch of people up to Martha's Vineyard. We are disposing of people in ways that I think are unconscionable. Now, I also want to just touch as well on another spatial injustice that was visited on our cities, and that's urban freeways. The federal program with local and state implementation was basically to bust up communities. And this is between West Oakland and downtown Oakland. But if any of you are into geographical information systems, go get the demographics of a city and then overlay the freeways, and you will notice something very, very strong. Now, the problem is the Biden administration did give money for freeway removal. Not much, but several cities, Rochester and various other cities, took them up on it. Problem is, what do you put after the freeway's been taken down? If you put green space there, you're going to get gentrification on steroids. One of the reasons why house prices are low around these freeways is because it's a disamenity for many people. So you have to think very carefully, what are we going to put there? And before you even start the project, you have to have housing affordability and housing stabilization policies around for about a mile either side of the freeway. Otherwise, you're going to get gentrification. You can't do that after the freeways. Once the freeway's in place, gentrification has already happened. Now, a really interesting idea from a friend of mine, Elijah Anderson at Yale. Elijah talks about the cosmopolitan canopy. He says most of us walk down the streets studiously trying to not look at each other. But he said there are spaces in cities called cosmopolitan canopies where people come together across difference. And the picture in there is the Reading Terminal Market in Philly, where people, different cultural, racial, gender, all sorts of groups, sit over food, watch a game, talk about different foods, eat each other's foods. There's so many different ways that people can actually get creative like this. These cosmopolitan canopies are a place where people can talk in a perhaps depoliticized sense. Other sort of places are kids' spaces, you know, where kids play under the water that squirts up and all the parents sit around the edge and people chat. As a dog owner, dog parks are the same. The dog is the focus and you can just chat to people. We need these spaces of engagement because, I don't need to tell you, we're pulling apart. We need spaces of engagement where we can listen to each other. And a very important principle comes out of this. It's called contact theory. the more contact you have with people who are different from you, the more likely you are to treat them with dignity, empathy, and care, and the more likely you are to be pushing for more progressive, integrative, inclusionary policies. And so I ask the question, what is the role for planners, urban designers, in seeding or creating these cosmopolitan canopies? Now, I'm not arguing that cosmopolitan canopies are an end to racism, but they are the beginning of a conversation where people start to talk across difference. And we need that. We need people to begin to understand each other. Complete Streets is another tool, and it's what they did in Sweden, in Södervägen, as I showed you. We're now doing it in the US. Every town and city in the US has a Complete Streets manual, a guide, and these are some of them from, on the right from Toronto, Somerville, Mass DOT, Swampscott, Massachusetts. Your town has a guide on complete streets. But what is a complete street? What is a complete street? On the right is what the urban designers design as a complete street. On the left is a street where the social ecology of the street has... We can't design that market. That happens because of who's in the neighbourhood, the people that are there, and the social relations imbued in that space. And so Doreen Massey, the late great geographer, says places, and I'm taking streets as places, are constantly shifting articulations of social relations over time. But yet, my profession, the urban designers, they see complete streets as a design challenge, not as a human or socio-ecological challenge. And to give you a really good example, Los Angeles. Los Angeles, believe it or not, has a very big, because it's a very big city, it's got a very big complete streets program. They're playing catch up. They're trying to retrofit complete streets in what was a motor-dominated city. But one thing that is really interesting, over half the population of Los Angeles are from Southeast Asia or Latin America. And one of the key cultural icons of those countries is street food vending. And yet it was illegal until recently to be a street food vendor in LA. How do you have a complete streets policy when you are denying over half your population the right to do what their culture would have them do? That's changed now. LA finally grew up and is now permitting street vending. Go to any Latin American or Southeast Asian city and the vibrancy of those cities is largely due to the street food and the streetscape. Now, I mentioned earlier this idea of complete streets and greening neighbourhoods. What's happening, though, is, and it's certainly apparent in Boston and in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that these complete streets are joining up into green-lined areas, areas that are green neighbourhoods. And my book, Incomplete Streets, doesn't say complete streets is wrong. It just gets to the question, who gets to choose what a complete street is? Just like the minority Angelenos who couldn't do their street food vending or had to risk being arrested. We need a bigger discussion about what a complete street is. The Green Gentrification book on the right actually argues that greening neighbourhoods whitens neighbourhoods. Greener neighbourhoods are more expensive, the rents are higher, house prices are higher. So this is not like redlining. Greenlining, don't get me wrong, redlining was an explicitly racist idea to disinvest certain low-income and minority neighbourhoods. Greenlining is purely socioeconomic. If you can afford this neighbourhood, you can come in here. But we know that race and socioeconomics are fairly well tied together in the United States. One of the biggest indicators, I think, of urban sustainability is walkability. How walkable is your neighbourhood? And there's a scale from 0 to 100, where 100 is perfectly walkable and that everything that you need is within 4 or 5 minutes walk. So there's an app for this. There's an app for everything now, isn't it? WalkScore is the app. But the app is owned by, get this, Redfin, the realty company. we have compromised and commodified sustainability. So now the realtors are involved. And I guarantee, if you buy a house in a neighbourhood that is 90 plus on the walkability scale, it will be on the details of the place that you're buying or renting. It will be on those details. We're using walkability as a way of selling places. So I do want you to think that, you know, greening is bad. It's not bad. But we have to have a democratization of greening. We want every neighbourhood to be green. Why should it be linked to socioeconomic status? And if we think about, you know, so I've been talking about streets, let's talk about other urban spaces, parks, urban parks. This book, Rethinking Urban Parks, Public Space and Cultural Diversity, not biodiversity, cultural diversity. The argument that Setha Lowe and her colleagues are making is, in this new century, the 21st century, we're facing a different kind of threat to public space, not one of disuse, but of patterns of design and management that exclude some people and reduce social and cultural diversity. So the way we design and manage, and I would argue program our public spaces, can reduce social and cultural diversity. Remember, a lot of parks were designed 100, 150 years ago for populations who are very different from the present population. Do we know about the recreational habits of different migrant and immigrant groups, both new and established? And again, this idea of contact theory comes into play. Our public spaces are places where we can meet across difference. How do we design culturally inclusive public spaces? Can we do that? Now, you all know Boston's got some storied public spaces, the legacy of Olmsted, etc. A report came out 21 years ago by Lanfer and Taylor, and they made a really important point. The lack of engagement of more recent immigrants in Friends of the Park organisations and other environmental groups of today has led to concerns that while Olmsted's vision continues to resonate with a great many Bostonians, it may not resonate with the majority of those who will decide Boston's future. Boston's changing. Lanfer and Taylor wrote this before Mayor Wu became mayor. She has transformed city government. Whether you like it or not, she's transformed city government. It looks, the city employee base looks like the city of Boston now. How do we get these Friends of the Park organisations that are very elite groups of people, and largely people who can bring in money to the Esplanade, to the Boston Common, the Boston Garden, how do we get them to diversify in tune with a changing city? So if we want to engage immigrants in public spaces, maybe we need to look to some of the organisations that are responsible for funding some of the work that goes on in public spaces. Or we can see what immigrants themselves do. I think one of the reasons that that place is so popular with us Latinos is because of the willows. Willows in Guatemala are very common. They grow beside rivers. People like Herta Park on the Charles River because it looks like home. Immigrants vote with their feet. They go to places and spaces that make them feel comfortable and make them feel a sense of place. That's all they're looking for, a sense of place. And again, hold on to this because I'm going to talk about this in relation to food and some other issues as well. So I call this landscape links. People gravitating to landscapes that are familiar to them from where they've come. And it happens, a Turkish group went to the White Cliffs of Dover in Britain. They'd come from the Cappadocia region, the limestone region of Turkey, and they found the White Cliffs of Dover very appealing. People like to have an empathy with their surroundings. In Denmark, in Copenhagen, there is a district called Nørrebro, which is a largely immigrant district, and there's an amazing park called Superkilen Park, and it's a linear park, and guess what goes down the middle? It's Copenhagen, there's a cycle path down the middle. But you can see the three aspects of the park here, and what the Danes did was they worked with local communities, and they said, what will make this park more special to you? What will enhance the sense of place? And they said, bring artifacts from our home cultures, artifacts. And so you can walk around this space, and if you ever go to Copenhagen, don't just do the usual tourist things. Take a 10-minute to come up to Nørrebro. The detail, whether you're from Ghana, Mexico, Spain, Russia, Poland, there's all these different artifacts, and all the communities started to learn about each other's cultures through the different artifacts. So again, belonging can come through design. We can help people to belong by designing spaces and places that are redolent of their own cultures. The Department of Landscape at Sheffield University back in the UK have a transnational urban outdoors research group. And what they are pushing is that we need not just demographic information about communities, which really tells us what percentage is Asian, African American, white, Latino. We need deep ethnographic information. Ethnographic information tells us about the worldviews and the cultures. The journal article in the middle that I've highlighted is on ethnographic understandings of ethnically diverse neighbourhoods to inform urban design practice. We know what we need to do. We need to do this. And I could see cities with their local communities co-producing ethnographies. Imagine if every council worker had access to a database. Because believe me, I know this. Some urban planners, environmental health people, public health people, they know the demographics of the neighbourhood they're working in, but they don't understand the culture. So I think this deep ethnography idea would work really well. The Institute of the Transnational Urban Outdoors Research Group also came out with this resource book, Refugees Welcome in Parks. Refugees, asylum seekers are some of the most bruised and damaged and traumatised people. What do they need in terms of public space to help them heal from their trauma? The second case study I wanted to give you is looking at Minneapolis. And I've called this Urban Planning as a Tool of White Supremacy, the Other Lesson from Minneapolis. Just as a matter of interest, one thing that I really think is interesting about Minneapolis, and I compare it to, say, somewhere like Boston, I heard that 93% of the police in Minneapolis don't live in Minneapolis. They come in from the suburbs. Boston has a residency requirement. Every Boston police officer must be a resident. And the only reason I say that, and thinking about 5 years ago, is, just think about a standoff in Boston or Minneapolis between the police and young people. Imagine the cops are standing on one side, the young people, and a young cop sees a kid, that's my younger brother's friend. There's a chance of a connection, a chance to stand down. But if you don't know any of the kids or their relatives, that's less likely to happen in my book. But let's look at Minneapolis, a green utopia for many. It's got the best park system. Year after year, Minneapolis wins awards from the Trust for Public Lands for its parks. It's one of the best cities in the US for exercise. It's got the third most bike commuters. The miracle of Minneapolis, affordable, lots of opportunity, the ability to amass some wealth. But also, Minneapolis has the worst, or among the worst, racial inequality indices in the nation. The black-white income gap is very high. But more importantly, the black-white home ownership gap, the so-called wealth gap, is right up there among the top in the nation. And the state of Minnesota opportunity or achievement gap in schools is incredibly high between white and Native American and white and black students. So again, green does not mean social justice. So why is Minneapolis the focus of our attention in so many ways? excellent project, Mapping Prejudice. Kirsten Delegard, a historian, said all that civic rhetoric about Minneapolis being a model metropolis at the cutting edge of great urban planning obscures some darker truths about the city. And I wanted to find out what these darker truths were. So I looked back and I found that in 1900, Minneapolis had a small but very evenly spread population of colour. In 1910, to be precise, they introduced racial covenants. This home shall not be let or sold to anybody other than members of the Caucasian race. By 1930, you could see the emergence of black North Minneapolis and black South Minneapolis. 20 years, the change had happened. Add on to that in 1917, the US Supreme Court struck down racial zoning. I think Baltimore was the last, to stop doing it. So cities were scrambling. How are we going to segregate if we don't have racial zoning? So they said, let's do large lot or single family zoning, price them out. This is called exclusionary zoning. 70% of Minneapolis's zoning was single family, including around the parks, to keep people away from the parks who were not desirable. And then we had redlining, the designation of certain neighborhoods as hazardous or Group D neighborhoods, where there would be no federal or private sector financing. The result of this is racial segregation then and now. We are now, as urban planners, dealing with the legacy of the shift from racial planning to this more reparative model of planning. But, covenants, single-family zoning, redlining, each was very effective. But think about the cumulative and synergistic effects of these policies. Now, only one country did it better than us, and that was apartheid South Africa, and in 1994, that all stopped. And at the moment now, they're trying to retrofit more just and equitable cities. And that's a long way to go from apartheid city to just and sustainable city. But one thing that, I still haven't really thought about in my own mind is the South Africans, it was a philosophy. It was an absolute philosophy. Apartheid was a philosophy. We don't have a philosophy around this. We're just pretty good at coming out with policies that achieve what we want to achieve without coming out and saying maybe what we should say. So what now for Minneapolis? Well, the former director of long-range urban planning recognizes the linkages between those late 19th century, early 20th century practices and the legacy today. I say urban planning is the spatial toolkit for articulating and implementing and maintaining white supremacy, and we can do something about it. So, what is Minneapolis doing? You can go online, just Google Minneapolis 2040, very ambitious, comprehensive plan. Goal number one of which is eliminate disparities. In 2040, Minneapolis will see all communities fully thrive regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, country of origin, religion, or zip code, having eliminated deep-rooted disparities in wealth, opportunity, housing, safety, and health. We need visionary concepts like that. They've got 15 years to do it. They're working hard at it. It's not an easy thing to do, especially in the current political climate. There are 39 different policies attendant to that one goal of eliminating disparities, some of which, environmental justice and green zones, aimed at black and South North and South Minneapolis. They're talking about park design and programming, reconfiguring the parks as more inclusive spaces, and they're also talking about freeway remediation. So some of the things I talked about as spatial segregators or spatial injustices are being talked about. My third and final set of case studies is related to food justice. And the psychologists tell me if I leave this slide on for 1 minute, 20% of you will be on Amazon ordering this book. So Get your phones out, please, folks. I need to eat, So, let me tell you a little story. What are local foods in intercultural societies? There was an amazing segment on NPR about 2011, and it was an interview with George and Julia Bowling, sadly now the late George and Julia Bowling, who were tobacco farmers in Maryland. Okay, state of Maryland is trying to get people out of growing tobacco, and they were thinking, what are we going to grow? How are we going to make some money? Being the good entrepreneurial American farmers that they are, they listened to somebody who said, there's 150,000 Africans in the DC metro area, and they want to eat African food. Not stuff flown in, frozen or whatever, but they want it grown locally. So George and Julia contacted the Extension Service of the University of Maryland and said, hey, strange question for you. Can we grow African food in our Maryland fields? And they said, well, let's find out. And they did some experiments. Turns out there's a lot that Africans use regularly that will grow in the Maryland terroir, as it were. And now the signboard to their farm is that, African produce. So you're driving down a leafy lane in Maryland and you come across a sign saying African produce. What is local food in an intercultural society? I'm a geographer, there's no definition of local. We can't say it's 37.5 miles from point A and then you're regional or national. No. Local is a relational concept. But what's clearly happening here is that often the foodies who are saying you should only eat local food are not those immigrants who want to eat what is culturally appropriate for them. And so I think there's a difference between geographic local and cultural local. And a lot of the immigrants see it the same way, like the Filipinos in San Diego, who, when asked by a researcher, what is local Filipino food to you? They said, it's the food we grow in our yards and the food we eat in our restaurants. So another principle for you to think about here, translocalism. Immigrants are bringing their own cultural local with them, whether it's the Guatemalan who sits by the willows, whether it's the Africans going out to Maryland, the Filipinos growing their own foods, the Canadian Chinese farmers in Greater Vancouver. 20% of the farmers in the Greater Vancouver region are Chinese Canadians. And these are their farms. They grow huge amounts of food for the very large Asian population up in the Canadian Pacific Northwest there. And it's interesting, not just for the Chinese. I gave this same lecture in Vancouver and I used this slide, and a young East African woman who just migrated to Canada came up to me. She said, Julian, I'm so glad you mentioned the Chinese farmers. I shop at their farmers markets. This is not the story we usually get about food and food justice. This is a different story. And the Chinese Canadian farmers don't use the largely white farmers markets. They've set up their own farmers markets in parallel. Now, we can argue the merits of that. And we could, as maybe committed interculturalists, think, well, why can't they all be together? This is the way it is. But they're clearly catering not just to a Chinese market, but to a wider market. In South Central LA, until 2006, was the biggest urban farm in the United States, South Central Farm. 95% of the workers there, the farmers, were Latin American. And then it was bulldozed. There was the owner of the land wanted it back. I don't think the land's been used since. It was a terrible shame. But I just want to read you what one of these women said. And again, you'll see the theme I'm pushing here. I planted this garden because it's a little space like home. I grow the same plants that I had back in my garden in Oaxaca. We can eat like we ate at home, and this makes us feel like ourselves. It allows us to keep a part of who we are after coming to the United States. And not only are they growing culturally appropriate foods like they did at home, but if you look And if you can see where the chain link fence is, there's prickly pear cactus. In Oaxaca, they use those to designate field boundaries. So these people are creating what the anthropologists call an autotopography. They are inscribing their culture and community on the landscape. In urban planning, we call this placemaking. They are placemaking. They are nesting. In other places, and there's 50 and counting around the country, there are refugee agricultural spaces. The closest one to us, and Tufts University has a role in it, is called New Entry Farms in Lowell, Massachusetts. And this is where the university, a non-profit, and funding from the state of Massachusetts, immigrant farmers come and get a first footing in farms. And it's an intercultural experience because they learn from the white farmers learn from them. So again, these are spaces of engagement where that chance encounter between, a native of Lowell and a person from Laos might just start a conversation. What's that you're eating? Well, go home, cook it, come back, let me know. My wife loves it. Well, come round to dinner. The kind of opportunistic kind of thing that can happen through food. Oh, another book opportunity here. Sorry about this. So this is my second to latest book, The Immigrant Food Nexus, Borders, Labour and Identity in North America. If you're interested, wise up on this. It's one of the not too often spoken about things. 70% of the workers in the food chain, from the fields to the restaurants, are undocumented immigrants. Just let that sink in. What is going to happen to food prices? First thing, what is going to happen to them, of course, and I'm not advocating that, that anything special happens just because we want cheap food. Some people think the food system is broken. No, it's not. It's doing exactly what it was intended to do. First through slavery and now through this more recent form of slavery. But the intersection of immigration and food policy in the US is absolutely fascinating. A couple more thoughts before I wind up. Leadership and vision. We need leaders who call it out. And again, my friend and the Mayor of Boston, Michelle Wu, has an excellent food justice agenda for a resilient Boston. If you look at the key issues, public health, small business, economic justice and worker rights, closing the racial wealth gap. We can use concepts like food justice not to just put culturally appropriate foods on the table, but to generate small businesses, to improve public health, to improve economic justice. But we can only do that if we acknowledge that food justice is an aspect of racial justice. It demands a clear-eyed understanding of how white supremacy has shaped our food system. Remember, all the food deserts are in red-lined neighborhoods. All the food deserts are in red-lined neighborhoods. The hunger in some people's stomachs is because of racist urban planning. That's the conclusion we must come to. So we need to understand that food justice means racial justice, and we need to understand and dismantle the way that white supremacy has shaped our urban food systems. So let me summarize. We need to manage our coexistence in shared space with people who are different from us. We need to think about belonging, who gets to belong, as well as what our cities and spaces can become. We need to foster engagement and belonging using this deep ethnography idea, understanding different cultures, worldviews, practices and spatial alignments. We need to engage interculturally, culturally competent planning and policy making. We need to practice humane-scaled and human-scaled urban planning and design. And above all, we really need to understand we don't get to social justice. We need to put social justice in as a policy goal. Too often I see, sometimes my students think, oh, what are the economic ramifications? What are the environmental? What are the technical ramifications? And then they think, oh, well, social justice comes later. No. Social justice and equity have to go in with that mix. We have to center them and be mindful about them, and then we will move towards more socially just societies. Every policy and plan that I've seen that has enhanced social justice has had a consideration of social justice in at the beginning. And my closing thought, and another book opportunity, and this book, folks, this is a bargain because it's open access. So, Sacred Civics, Building 7-Generation Cities. I want to leave you with this thought, and it's becoming clearer and clearer to me that our greatest challenges are not scientific or technological. They're deeper than that. They're spiritual and cultural. Thank you.
So this is really tall. We have about 5 minutes for questions. So anybody with questions? Wait for the, excuse me, sorry. Okay. There's this amazing thing, it's a microphone.
Hello. Okay, it works.
That was really great, thank you. At a very practical level, in our urban environments, how do we motivate change with politicians and those who have to implement some of these ideas? What are the obstacles, and what are some of the best practices that you've seen in the U.S. and overseas?
Well, motivating politicians. Politicians, they're quite avaricious in a lot of ways. I remember former mayor of Boston, Mayor Menino, saying, "I want Boston to be greener than Chicago." This was when, during the Daley years, and Chicago was doing a whole load of stuff. And I use this as an example with my students. I say, if we get to greater greening or greater sustainability through the greed and avarice and ego of politicians, is that okay? And most of them agree it is. We need sustainability. We need more sustainable cities. And if this is the way in late stage capitalism we can do it, then let's do it that way. I mean, we can't just sit around and sing Kumbaya and expect our cities to become more sustainable. So, let's show our mayors what's possible. And a lot of mayors go on, and we call them boondoggles, but they're not. They often go to places and look at case studies. One of the great ones is bus rapid transit in Curitiba, Brazil. 1973, the mayor of Curitiba said, "We are not best serving all our people. The streets are clogged. Let's implement this bus rapid transit system." And now people from all around the world go and see what's happened. And so every BRT scheme, and we've got one in Boston, and they're all around the world, not just in blue cities, but in red cities as well. So we need to show what is possible and how things work well. I don't know whether any of you have read the New York Times recently about the unmitigated success that congestion pricing has been. After all of the naysaying, every single factor has improved, from delivery bike times to taxis to bus movement. We need to show what is possible, not continually obfuscating with, "Oh, we need more research," or no, we haven't got time for that. We know what to do. We know what to do in terms of sustainability, we're just not doing it. So one thing is, yes, we need more enlightened leaders and leaders who understand what can happen. But we also need big attitudinal shifts among the public. And we've got that in Boston at the moment. We've got this battle coming up over bike lanes. At first, most people seem to like them, and now there's a backlash against bike lanes. It's happening in Toronto, it's happening in other places. How do we change public attitudes? One thing we do know is information is not enough. There's a gap between giving people information and then expecting them to act in an environmentally or pro-environmental way. What we need to do is create a choice architecture where people choose to do the right thing. And, there's a lot of sort of social psychological models now, economic psychological models, which are helping us think about how do we get the public to act in an environmentally friendly way? And final example, a lot of my students will say, well, Julian, the Europeans are so much more sustainable than us. And I say, are you suggesting that Europeans have more genes for sustainability, or what are you suggesting? And they can't quite work it out. And I say, it's nothing to do with that. Europeans, the average European in a European city has about 5 different choices about getting around, from rapid interurban trains to buses, streetcars, subways, separated bike lanes. Europeans are more sustainable because they have the choice to be more sustainable. I think if Americans had more choices, we pride ourselves in this country on having choice. We don't have choice. In so many communities, we just don't have choice. So that's what we need to give people, is give them more choices. Get some competition happening between these different modes. Get prices to come down. Great question. Thank you.
One. Oh, shoot. Okay.
I just wondered if you were familiar with the parks in Dallas and how they're doing.
In Dallas, I'm not actually.
Oh, yes.
Do you?
The former publisher of the Dallas paper has built 3 or more huge parks, replacing parking lots.
Fantastic.
And one of them is one of those long parks that you described.
I'll look into that. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, yeah. That's a great use for old parking lots. I mean, and think about some suburban malls that are now not being used. I mean, there's a big talk now about suburban agriculture, creating suburban farms out of these spaces, yeah.
There are many cities around the country and the world that have crumbling river canals. And I'm wondering, I mean, that's something that I've been thinking about and working on just as I'm a botanist, and so I'm looking at the plants that are growing in them and taking the walls apart and the water that's taking the walls apart. But wondering about how to present that as an opportunity to a city for more space, when often those river canals coincide with busy traffic lanes.
Sure.
But yet they're just waiting for buildings and infrastructure to have a catastrophe.
It's a great question. There's a huge worldwide movement to, re-embrace our rivers, because we turned our backs on them for a long time, didn't we? I mean, because, they were open sewers for a long time, and then, we revegetated them. We took, some of them were in culverts, and we opened the culverts and, revegetated the riverbanks. The best example I know, the biggest example, is in Seoul, South Korea. They had they had a freeway going over, literally covering over a river, and they took the freeway down. And now, if you look at this example, I think it's called the Cheongyong River or something, but it's like an esplanade on either side, and little cafes and things like that. We have to show people what is possible. Again, show people what's possible, and they use these things. Now, I mean, the High Line, look at that whole neighborhood, how it's changed. Gentrification aside, and everything is so expensive there now, but, I had a couple of friends coming over from the UK, and they're not urban planners. The first thing they said to me when we got to New York was, let's go and see the High Line. It's become a remarkable space, and many, many cities are doing that now. So we have to share good practices, to your point. We have to share what cities can do. We have to, showcase these environments and really show people that a better quality of life can be had by all for doing these projects. I mean, Giuliani wanted to rip down the High Line. What a shame that would have been. But a group of well-heeled, high-publicity locals said, hey, we got a better idea. And thankfully they won.
Thank you.
Okay, one more question, and you're it. Thank you.
Over here?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for your lecture. I'm curious, having listened to your lecture, what you think about privately owned public spaces. I was fortunate enough to be an employee of 3 different city agencies in New York City: the Department of Parks, Department of Environmental Protection, and the Department of Transportation. And our biggest problem was not people who really wanted to implement the ideas that are here in your presentation. It was money, and then as a subset, it was time. And as somebody who frequented a lot of New York City's parks, the nicest places are places that are privately owned but accessible to the public. The Elevated Acre, the High Line is not quite an example, but there are many commodities within the High Line that help feed into Friends of the High Line, the Park Alliance group, that help maintain it. And so I'm curious, as we move into the future and we see systematic defunding of public agencies, what you think the role of privately owned public spaces is in the future.
Well, it's a great thought. Ever since neoliberalism and before, but especially since the late 70s, early 80s, we've seen the, encroachment of private space into public space and the privatization of space and then allowing the public in. Malls, malls are private spaces, and this is, in many ways why they're a strange place. You can be kicked out of a mall because you're not there for the primary purpose of purchasing. It's not a public space for anything else other than purchasing. And so there are, I think if you have enlightened owners of these POPs, as they're called, privately owned public spaces, if you have private owners who are enlightened, then they can work. But I'm absolutely against the privatization of public spaces. But it's the same as selling off of, schools and other public assets. It's the same sort of principle. And we need, you've seen very clearly my thinking on this, we need our public spaces, and we need them to be inclusive and accessible and brave spaces. If all we've got is POPs, then at least let's hope that we have enlightened owners of those spaces. And wasn't Zuccotti Park as well? That's a POP.
Yes.
Yeah, Zuccotti Park, where the the
Occupy Wall Street movement.
Exactly.
occurred.
Yeah.
And we do have some of Julian's books, one of his titles, Sacred Civics, for sale and autographing, right, in the lobby, so if anyone is interested. But again, thank you so much for all of your time and your commitment. And thanks again, Julian.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just going to sneak this back. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great.